Today, November 11, 2023, marks the 105th anniversary of the end of World War I, a topic in history that is often overlooked by its more destructive sequel. But World War I is just as important to world history as World War II. It was the first real modern war, and saw the introduction of modern weapons such as automatic gunfire, airplanes, and tanks. But with any war, or any event in history for that matter, it brings on a host of strange and obscure stories, from tales of battalions disappearing, to the most brutal of battles, to giant sea monsters that attacked the submarine. Yeah, just wait for that one. These mysteries and obscurities have been sorted into an iceberg chart, a way of organizing information where at the top, it's topics that everyone knows, but as you go further down, they become more obscure. Before we begin, I just have to give a massive thank you for 10,000 subscribers. That number is crazy to me, and it's only going up, but it can always go up faster, am I right? Make sure you're subscribed if you want to see more videos like this. But enough sappiness, let's talk about the war that ended all wars. America was very late to the party when it came to World War I. We officially joined the war effort on April 4th, 1917, and the war ended just over a year later. The American populace saw the war as nothing more than a European squabble, and we figured it'd be best to leave it and to mind our own business. This all changed with two major developments: the sinking of the Lusitania and the Zimmermann Telegram. The Zimmermann Telegram was a secret diplomatic note sent from the German Empire to the nation of Mexico in 1917. This was a proposal that if the United States were to enter the war against Germany, Mexico would attack their northern neighbor, and they would receive Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico once the war was over. The Zimmermann Telegram was written by Arthur Zimmermann, who was the German State Secretary for Foreign Affairs. He confirmed its validity on March 3rd, after British intelligence intercepted and translated it. Mexico never attempted an invasion, but they sure thought about it. But they backed off once they realized how stupid of an idea it would have been. President Venustiano Carranza had some of his generals assess the possibility of invading America, and they deemed it an unwinnable battle. You see, at this point, Mexico was going through a civil war, and even if every soldier in the nation would have been loyal to Carranza, they still stood no chance against America, who would join the war against Germany a month later. This is probably the most famous story when it comes to strange or interesting history, and it's the story of the Christmas truce in 1914. The story begins on Christmas Eve on the Western Front of the war. At about 10 p.m., British soldiers heard the sound of singing coming from far away, and soon enough, they joined in. Then what happened next caused this story to be written down in the history books. Soldiers from both sides began to poke their heads up, and soon enough, they were climbing up and greeting one another. Soldiers from two opposite warring nations began to greet one another to call a temporary ceasefire for the holiday. They sang carols and they played soccer matches together, and some lit Christmas trees in their trenches, and they all helped one another bury their past comrades. Eventually, Christmas Day was over, but it took the soldiers on each side a few days to resume fighting. Grigory Rasputin was a Russian mythic who is best well known for his strange death. He was a close friend and advisor to Tsar Nicholas II and his family. Rasputin was born in a small Siberian village in 1869. From a young age, he had a fascination with mysticism and religion, and in 1903, he traveled to St. Petersburg and met Nicholas II and his wife, Alexandra Feodorovna. He began acting as their personal faith healer, and helped their son Alexei recover from hemophilia. Rasputin's power and influence peaked in 1915, once Nicholas left St. Petersburg to oversee the Russian army. In his absence, Rasputin and Alexandra consolidated their influence across the Russian Empire. However, as Russian military defeats mounted on the Eastern Front, both figures became increasingly unpopular. On the evening of December 29, 1916, Rasputin was invited to a dinner by Prince Felix Yusupov. He gave the mystic man 2 cakes and several glasses of wine, all poisoned with cyanide, but Rasputin didn't seem to care, and he in fact asked for more. Stop and think about that for a second. This dude, who claimed to be a holy man of God, with the power to heal, just ate enough cyanide to kill 12 people, and he was asking you for more. Felix took the next appropriate steps, shooting him 3 times in the chest, and then dumping his body in a frozen lake. After a few days, his body was found, and it was determined that the gunshots had killed him, not the cyanide. Another story of wacky and weird history that a lot of people know is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand was to be the heir to the Austrian-Hungarian throne, but was sent to Spain by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian nationalist. However, the events leading up to this weren't exactly in a straight line, and he almost survived the day due to the suspect's incompetency. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was visiting Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Bosnia was annexed by Austria-Hungary 6 years earlier, and this angered Bosnian nationalists as they felt they should be a part of the Balkans as one massive country. One such Bosnian who was upset was Gavrilo Princip, who was a part of a group called Young Bosnians, a secret society of students who began to plot against the Archduke. When the fateful day in June rolled around, a group of young Bosnians threw a bomb at the Archduke's car as he drove by. However, the bomb bounced off the car and blew up a different car, injuring 2 army officers. The assassin who threw the bomb, Njelko Kabrinovic. The assassin who threw the bomb, Njelko Kabrinovic, then jumped over a bridge and took a capsule of cyanide, but the cyanide was expired, causing him to just get a stomachache. He was then arrested. Gavrilo heard about the failure, so he called off the rest of the plan, instead going to get breakfast at a local shop. Back with the Archduke, instead of fleeing Sarajevo, he wanted to visit the injured soldiers in the hospital. However, the Archduke's motorcade turned down the wrong street, a street with a certain diner on it. The certain diner that Gavrilo Princip went to get a sandwich at. As he left the shop, he saw the Archduke's car, and he fired 2 shots at nearly point-blank range, killing both the Archduke and his wife. This was the major catalyst for World War I, as Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the Archduke's death, and they declared war on them a month later, beginning World War I. The Battle of the Somme was the bloodiest battle of World War I, and is in the top 5 bloodiest battles throughout all of human history. This was a fight on the Western Front that saw British and French forces fight against Germany amongst the Somme River in northern France. The fighting began on July 1st, 1916, and right off the bat, the battle gained a reputation for bloodshed, as the first day of the fighting saw over 57,000 British casualties, the bloodiest day in British war history. For the next 4 months, a war of attrition was fought, with little advancements, and mass amounts of casualties affecting both sides of the effort. In November of 1916, the Allied powers made a final push against Germany, but once again, this saw little effectiveness. With the onset of winter weather, Field Marshal Douglas Haig, who was overseeing the British effort, called the advance off, bringing the Battle of the Somme to a close. The Battle of the Somme is called an Allied victory, as they significantly hurt the German positions in France, but it was a very costly win. All in all, the Battle of the Somme saw over 1 million casualties spread out across British, French, and German forces, giving it the title of the bloodiest battle of World War I. The Armenian Genocide was the attempted obliteration of the Armenian Christian people that were living in the Ottoman Empire. It lasted for a little over a year, and saw as many as 1.2 million Armenians be killed by the Ottomans. Now, I don't want to get into every horrible detail that happened here, but I do want to focus on the cover-up of the topic. Ever since it happened, the Ottoman Empire, which later became Turkey, has denied involvement in the Armenian Genocide. Turkish leaders have bribed historical authorities to cover up the truth behind what really happened. Over several decades, they have paid tens of millions of dollars to US politicians in an attempt to get them to not recognize the genocide, but this has failed, as the US House of Representatives recognized it in 1975, 1984, and in 2019. Moreover, 2 presidents have acknowledged it, with Reagan in 1981 and Biden with 2 times in 2021 and in 2022. When World War I broke out, Germany wanted to quickly take out France so they could focus all of their forces on Russia, as they didn't want to fight a war on 2 fronts. So German Field Marshal Alfred von Schlieffen came up with the Schlieffen Plan. Schlieffen thought France was way too weak to prevent a German invasion, and he assumed Russia would take at least a month to mobilize their troops. He also thought Germany could quickly get to France by invading the neutral country of Belgium, but Belgium had an ally in Great Britain, who didn't like having their friend trampled over by another country. So on the very same day Germany invaded Belgium, Britain declared war on Germany, bringing them into the mix of the Great War. To further add to Germany's mounting problems, the Schlieffen Plan was a failure in other regards, as Russia attacked East Germany 10 days after they invaded France, a whole lot quicker than the 6 months that was originally estimated, causing the War on Two Fronts to begin. Before World War I began, Russia was already facing several issues. In the early 1900s, Russia was one of Europe's poorest nations, and several conflicts, like the Crimean War, caused mass amounts of food shortages. We then get to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, in which Russia lost, further weakening both the nation and the public opinion of Tsar Nicholas II. This caused many Russians to look at the rest of Europe, seeing how their social, technological, and scientific advancements were causing the nations to prosper, while the rule of the Tsars was hampering Russia's development. This caused large amounts of protests to break out across the nation in 1905. These protests were beaten back by the Tsar's troops, causing hundreds of deaths in an event known as Bloody Sunday. We're now going to fast forward to World War I, in which Russia is now on the verge of collapse. Food and fuel reserves were at an all-time low, while inflation was at an all-time high. To add on to this, Tsar Nicholas was usually on the front lines, allowing Rasputin to take more power like we mentioned earlier. All of this led up to the boiling point known as the February Revolution, in which demonstrators began fighting with the police. On March 11, 1917, a squadron of Russian troops broke up the protest. Now, there was a big accomplishment with the February Revolution, as Tsar Nicholas advocated the throne, and a provisional government was set up. Later in the year, in October, the real Russian Revolution began, being led by Vladimir Lenin. Lenin assembled the Bolsheviks, a political party of which he was the head of. They took power from the little government Russia had left. 1 month later, Lenin began peace talks with Germany, which culminated in March of 1918, bringing Russia out of the fold of World War I. This allowed Germany to focus all of their efforts on the Western Front, but in the meantime, they had a new beast to tangle within the United States, but that's for later. We're now done with Tier 1. If you watched my World War II Iceberg, you'll remember I added 2 extra tiers full of stories I thought needed to be included in the iceberg. While there are some stories left out of this iceberg I thought needed to be in it, there wasn't really enough to justify an extra tier. So instead, I'll include them at the end of each tiers. There's 8 stories in total, and the first one is that of Henry Gunther. Henry Gunther was drafted into the war in September of 1917 as a part of America's 313th Infantry Regiment. As a supply sergeant, he was responsible for his unit's clothing. The armistice was signed at 5 in the morning, but wouldn't go into effect for another 6 hours, at 11 in the morning. At 10:59, Henry Gunther and one of his friends spotted a German roadblock. Gunther rose and did a bayonet charge against the orders of his friends. The Germans, knowing the armistice would go into effect in 1 minute, tried to stop him, but Henry kept coming. So with a short burst of automatic fire, he was killed, with less than 1 minute of the war remaining, making him one of, if not the last soldiers killed in World War I. We're gonna do a quick mention of the last French soldier to be killed, Augustin Trebuchet, who was the messenger delivering the news that soup was being served for lunch. Tier 2 begins with a propaganda poster, and I'll just let you look at it for a second. There's a bit to unpack here. This was a poster made by America encouraging young men to enlist in the war against Germany, who they demonstrate here with a gorilla for some reason. There's not much information here, unless I'm missing something. During World War I, America also had the propaganda poster of Uncle Sam. You know, the dude dressed in red, white, and blue, pointing at you, asking you to go die in Europe. Yeah, this was made during the same war. There's a universe out there where this is the most famous propaganda poster from World War I. In October of 1917, 3 young Portuguese shepherds claimed to have been visited by the Virgin Mary 6 times between May and October of the same year. According to the shepherds, around noon on July 13th, Mary entrusted the children with 3 secrets. Lucia Santos revealed the first 2 secrets in 1941, and the first one was a vision of hell. I'll read exactly what she wrote. Our Lady showed us a great sea of fire, which seemed to be under the earth. Plunged in this fire were demons and souls in human form, like transparent burning embers. The second secret was about World War I, about how it would end, and soon be replaced with another greater war, that of course being World War II. Lucia was hesitant to reveal the third secret, but was asked to write it down so that it wouldn't be lost to history, as Lucia was very sick at this point. She did, and the envelope was opened in 2000. It claimed that Christians would be persecuted in the 20th century, and claimed that a bishop dressed in all white would be assassinated. People have related this to the attempt on Pope John Paul II on May 13th, 1981, which happened to be on the feast day of Our Lady of Fatima, as May 13th was said to be the first day the Virgin Mary appeared to the children. Now this is my third iceberg I've covered, and throughout all three of them, and all throughout the ones in the future, I'll remind you that stories in history like this are exactly that, stories. There is little proof to back them up, and it's up to you to decide if they were real or not. On August 16, 1888, Thomas Edward Lawrence was born in North Wales. He later moved to Oxford for his schooling and became obsessed with the medieval times, choosing to study them. He traveled the Middle East, observing the culture there, and he slowly fell in love with it. Once World War I broke out, he joined the British Army as a part of the Military Intelligence Department. He was sent to Mesopotamia to negotiate the release of Allied soldiers taken prisoner there. His previous experience living in the Middle East, along with knowing the language, helped him motivate the Arab tribesmen to revolt against the Ottoman Empire. He also promised independence once the war was over. He helped organize them in conducting guerrilla attacks, causing the focus of the Ottoman soldiers to be diverted, allowing Britain to focus on their main advances in Palestine. Unfortunately, Lawrence was unsuccessful in his mission to gain independence for the various Arabic nations, and after the war was over, he led a quiet life. He wrote several books, including his most well-known one, The 7 Pillars of Wisdom, which was an autobiographical account of the Arab Revolt. He passed away in 1935 after he wrecked his motorcycle. In 1962, a film about his life called Lawrence of Arabia was made, starring Peter O'Toole as the titular hero. During the early stages of the Great War, a strange phenomenon was sweeping across many of the British soldiers on the front lines. Their symptoms included tinnitus, amnesia, headaches, dizziness, tremors, and hypersensitivity to noise. These symptoms were usually associated with someone who had a physical injury to the brain, but none of these soldiers had any visible injuries. These soldiers were experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, or what would be named very shortly after this, shell shock. The term shell shock was first reported on in 1915, and some pretty frightening images of soldiers experiencing this were coming out. They seemed to be in a daze, completely oblivious to the conflict that surrounded them. This is probably the most famous piece of the sort, and this is of a British soldier in the trenches at the Battle of Flores-Courcelles. In September of 1916, it was reported that nearly 250,000 soldiers experienced some type of shell shock or PTSD during or post World War I. The Gallipoli Campaign was a military operation that took place from April 25, 1915 to January 9, 1916. It was an attempt by the Allied powers to capture the Gallipoli Peninsula from the Ottoman Empire, which would have allowed them to attack the Ottoman capital, Istanbul. But it was Constantinople at that point. Don't ask why, it's the Turks' business, not ours. Anyways, Gallipoli was a complete failure, and it saw 112,000 dead between both sides. Gallipoli began as a series of sea landings, which began this long set of failures, as this is where they saw their first major set of losses. Once they were landed, they quickly became bogged down in a set of trench battles against the well-defended Ottoman forces. They weren't exactly used to the hot and humid weather of Turkey, and they quickly ran out of supplies, especially drinking water. Eventually, the Allies retreated in January of 1916, proving the Ottomans weren't as weak as originally thought, and that the Allies weren't invincible. To say the Romanovs were unpopular in Russia would be a massive understatement. This family was hated across the nation, and on July 17, 1918, the populace was able to take their anger out. Like we discussed earlier, the Romanovs were removed from their palace in March of 1917, and they were about to be moved to Britain, but the king didn't want them in his nation because he knew how hated they were. We're now in July of 1918, when the Romanovs were living in an area called the House of the Special Purpose. Remember, Lenin was leading the country at this point, and he was staunchly against the Romanovs, which led to the following events. Late into the night, the Romanovs were woken up and told that several revolutionaries were surrounding their house, and they had to hide in the basement. But once they were taken to the basement, the doors were locked, and they were gunned down. Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children were dead. They were buried in the Kuptoyaki forest in unmarked graves. Canadians have been stereotyped as these incredibly calm and nice people, but what their soldiers did in World War I might ruin this perception for you. The most infamous story of Canadian soldiers committing war crimes comes when Canadian soldiers began throwing canned food into the neighboring German trenches, and which when the Germans asked for more, the Canadians threw grenades over instead. A year after the Christmas truce, some German soldiers attempted to call a truce by waving cigarettes at the Canadian soldiers, but in response, the Canadians shot the Germans. Trench raiding was the war at its most brutal, but it was reported that Canadian soldiers were almost enthusiastic when asked to go raid. World War I gained part of its infamy from chemical warfare, especially that used by Germany, but Canada was just as vile when it came to this. At the Second Battle of Ypres, the first widespread use of chemical warfare was observed, and the Canadian units here were probably hit the hardest. They never got over this, and they became one of the biggest users of chemical warfare. Canadian Corps Commander Arthur Currie was quoted as saying, "If we could have killed the entire German army by gas, we would have." I could go on for a shockingly long time, but I think you get the point. The butterfly effect is the idea that seemingly small and insignificant events can have massive and unpredictable consequences. The butterfly effect has been observed several times in history, and perhaps history's biggest butterfly effect happened in World War I. This is Henry Tanday, and on September 28, 1918, he was participating in the 5th Battle of Ypres. During this battle, he displayed heroism that earned him the Victoria Cross. But in the same battle he displayed such heroism, he inadvertently killed 80 million people because he saved one life. He held a German soldier at gunpoint, but after some hesitation, he let him go, sparing his life. That soldier was Mustache Man, who of course went on to start World War II, a conflict that killed upwards of 80 million people. 80 million lives lost because one was spared. Maybe. In the years since World War I, this story has been debated. The Mustache Man first learned of Tanday's identity after he saw a picture of him in the newspaper. He then presented the story of being spared, but some believe he was lying, especially Henry Tanday's biographer, Dr. David Johnson. He pointed out the fact that Mustache's unit was about 50 miles north of where Tanday was during the Ypres battle, making an encounter very unlikely. Johnson also claimed that the Chancellor was intent on proving he was in fact saved for a greater purpose, so he could have fabricated this story. Henry Tanday himself heard the story of him sparing history's worst villain, and he responded. He did say he spared several German lives during Ypres, but he had no idea if he actually spared the soon-to-be dictator. Once again, it's up to you to decide. In 1914, a Hungarian man was drafted into the Austro-Hungarian army, so he left his home to fight for his nation. He left his house in care of an elderly housekeeper. 2 years went by without a word, so his landlord went to clean out his house so they could rent it out to a new tenant. At the house, the landlord found several massive steel drums whose content would begin a several decades-long manhunt. Inside the drums were several bodies, drained of their blood and now soaking in pickle brine, so they could be preserved. The landlord called the police, and a search for the previous tenant began, the Hungarian soldier, Bela Kiss. Now, searching for a Bela Kiss in Hungary is like searching for a John Smith in America. It was an incredibly common name. Plus, this was in 1916, right in the middle of World War I, so any searches were hampered by the chaos brought on by the fighting. Later in 1916, Bela Kiss was recovering in a Serbian hospital when the authorities began to close in on him. They got to his bedside and found a decomposed body. Bela Kiss had placed a dead body in his bed and fled hours ago. From there, sightings of him were reported in Romania, Turkey, and France. The last sighting of Bela Kiss came in 1932, when a detective saw him working in New York City as a janitor. I don't know why he didn't try and stop him right then and there, as the Hungarian vampire was never caught, and his eventual fate, as well as the total number of victims he had, have been lost to history. If you watched my World War II Iceberg, you'll remember just about how much treasure was stolen and lost throughout the 6 years of the war. World War I isn't much different. There aren't as many stories of treasure disappearing, but the most prevalent one is that of the lost treasure of the Russian Tsars. As we discussed a few times throughout the Iceberg, pre, present, and post-World War I Russia was about as stable as the French government. You barely raise the price of wine over there and the whole country turns to a GTA lobby. Anyways, at the height of the Russian Civil War, one of the factions vying for power was the White Army, the side that was opposing Vladimir Lenin, and was supporting the provisional government in place. The White Army had control of about $20 million worth of the nation's gold reserves, and at their final defeat, only $12 million of it was returned. So what happened to the $8 million worth of gold? That's a stupid question. The country is going through a civil war, and this collection of yokels had access to that amount of gold, and we're surprised some of it went missing. I'm surprised any of it was returned at all. The soldiers filled their pockets and fled the country, probably the continent. According to one of the White Army soldiers, he said the gold was unloaded at a train station near the town of Komovoro and was buried nearby. In 1941, the Soviet secret police ordered him to take them to where it was buried, and boy howdy, guess what? He couldn't find it. What a surprise. The article I'm reading on it says it's still out there, waiting to be claimed by a lucky treasure hunter. No, it's not. It's gone. Don't bother. The USS Cyclops was a submarine built for the US Navy a few years before World War I began. Once the war began, the submarine joined the effort and was stationed near Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. The ship was loaded with 10,000 tons of manganese ore that was meant for Baltimore, Maryland. The ship had to make an emergency stop in the Caribbean nation of Barbados, as the ship's water level was over the Plimsoll line, a measurement meant for when ships are overloaded. And this ship was overloaded. It was only meant to carry 8,000 tons. The ship left Barbados on March 4th and was never seen again. The ship and its entire crew have vanished. Now it's theory time. As Cyclops was headed for Maryland, a massive storm swept over the Caribbean, and the combination of the overloaded condition, engine trouble, and bad weather may have sank the submarine. It's also thought that a German U-boat could have sank the Cyclops, as America was actively at war with Germany, and they were capable of reaching America. In fact, in the same year, a U-boat sank an American ship off the coast of Cape Cod. I want to believe the first theory, especially after recent events. Submarines are unpredictable, especially when you overload them. Actually, that makes it more predictable. Of course this thing sank. Or maybe a megalodon ate it. During World War I, an estimated 15 to 22 million people passed away, and this was the first war in a long time where a majority of the deaths didn't come from disease, but a massive chunk of these deaths did come from disease, about 1/3 of them, and the big killer was the Spanish flu. In March of 1918, the first case of Spanish flu was recorded at Fort Riley in Kansas, one of the United States. Due to this prison's overcrowding and unsanitary conditions, the Spanish flu quickly spread. We have to remember, World War I ended on March 11th of 1918, and in that 8-month period, many American soldiers headed to Europe to fight, and they brought the Spanish flu over there with them. But let's pause a second. If this thing originated in some prison in Kansas, why is it called the Spanish flu and not the Kansas flu? Well, this is due to the fact that most nations in Europe were in the middle of fighting World War I, and any negative news was to be censored to keep morale high. This wasn't the case for Spain. They freely reported on the Spanish flu, and this caused people to believe it originated here. The Spanish flu hit Europe pretty hard. The first wave was over in the first quarter of 1918, but this was the mother of all calm before the storms. As in August of 1918, the second wave began, and by September, over 200,000 people were dead. By April of 1920, there was an estimated 500 million cases of Spanish flu, and the usually accepted number of deaths ranges from 25 to 50 million deaths, but some historians have claimed it was closer to 100 million, which is absolutely insane. Let's put some modern context on this. At the time of recording this, just under 7 million people have died from that 2020 virus, and this ranges over 4 years. The Spanish flu killed nearly 4 times as many people in half the time. Anastasia Nikolavina was the youngest daughter of Tsar Nicholas II, who, like we said before, was gunned down with the rest of his family after Vladimir Lenin took power. They were then buried in an unmarked grave that wouldn't be discovered for another 63 years. But the grave only had 9 sets of remains, compared to the expected 11. The remains of Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, the family's doctor, their cook, one of their maids, and 3 out of 4 of the Tsar's daughters were found. No trace of Alexei, which was Nicholas's son, or Anastasia was found. This added fuel to the fire that Anastasia escaped her family's fate, fleeing before she could be killed. Several women have claimed to be Anastasia, and perhaps the most famous case of that was Anna Anderson. She claimed that once her family was killed, she pretended to be dead, and a kind guardian noticed her, and took her to safety. Anderson passed in 1984, and had DNA tests conducted on her remains, when it was found that she was in fact not Anastasia. So where's her body at then? Do you want the long answer or the short answer? We'll do the short one. In 2007, a Russian archaeologist found 2 partial skeletons while out metal detecting. After DNA tests were conducted, it was found that they were the bodies of Alexei Romanov and another Romanov. I forgot to mention, in the first mass grave of Romanovs discovered, it was inconclusive if one of the bodies was that of Maria Romanov or Anastasia Romanov, as the 2 were very close in age. Regardless, the last 2 Romanovs' bodies were found, putting the several decade-long mystery to a close. When I first read the Wikipedia article from Mata Hari, the line that immediately drew my attention was, she was executed by firing squad in France, so I knew I was in for a ride. Margetha Gertruda MacLeod, better known by her stage name, Mata Hari, was a Dutch-born performer. By the early 1900s, she had moved to Paris with her daughter. She quickly became entangled with a French diplomat who supported her dancing career. She enjoyed a lavish life of partying for the next few years, but by the time 1960 came around, she was nearly 40, and the Paris crowd had forgotten about her. Her boyfriend at the time, Russian Captain Vladimir Demeslov, was sent to the front lines of the war, where he was injured. Mata then accepted a new job to help pay for his health care, becoming a spy for France. She went to Germany, where she met a soldier. She began telling him mild secrets about France and their efforts, in an attempt to get the German soldier to reveal anything about their own efforts. Instead, these conversations were sent to Berlin, where they were intercepted by the French, where they heard one of their citizens telling state secrets in the middle of a dire war. Not good. So here's where some theorizing comes in, and people subscribe to 3 different truths. The first one is the story I told. She was a French spy who was spying on Germany, but was caught in the crossfire. The second theory is that Germany knew she was a spy, and they intentionally leaked it, knowing what would happen to her. Finally, the third idea is that she was a double agent, and she was really trying to leak French intel to the German forces. Regardless of what the truth is, Mata Hari was arrested for espionage on February 13, 1917. After a lengthy trial, Mata Hari revealed a German diplomat once offered to pay her 20,000 francs in exchange for her to spy on France, but she insisted she never accepted it. But this is all the French needed to hear. The trial came at a time when the Allies were failing to fight German advances. This caused real or imaginary spies to become scapegoats to explain the losses, and Mata Hari was one such victim. She was then executed by a firing squad on October 15, 1917. In 1917, Leonard Knight was on the front lines when a German soldier took a shot at him. The bullet hit Leonard square in the chest, right where his heart was. So by all accounts, he should have been dead. But the bullet didn't hit Leonard, because it was stopped by a Bible in his shirt pocket. In 1915, Leonard's aunt gave him a pocket Bible, and had written a note inside saying, "To Leonard, with love from Aunt Minnie, July 1915. Leonard kept this Bible in his pocket, and the bullet meant for his heart tore through 50 pages of the religious text before it was stopped. It's not known what happened to Leonard after this, and it's not known exactly where or when it happened. The Bible has been passed through 5 generations of his family, and it still has the bullet embedded inside." By the early 1900s, Germans made up one of the largest immigrant populations in the United States. Some 5 million Germans moved here, and of course, they brought their culture with them, and it was fitting in right with America's. In the 1910 census, there were 92 million first and second generation German Americans. The early 1910s also brought the Great War, where America was fighting Germany, causing tensions to rise at home. Attacks against the German populace began, and perhaps the most brutal one was in April of 1918, in which Robert Prager was brutally beaten by members of his community. But the anti-German sentiment didn't stop with attacks. Several German-themed things in culture were renamed. Sauerkraut became Liberty Cabbage, the Dachshund breed of dogs became Liberty Hounds, hamburger became Liberty Steak. Many things like this were changed in an attempt to move America away from Germany. Something similar to this happened in the early 2000s, as when the French government withheld support from the US military actions in Iraq, French fries became freedom fries. Manfred Albert Freiherr von Richthofen was a fighter pilot who served with the German Air Force during World War I. He is credited with 80 total air combat victories, making him the most credited fighter pilot of World War I. But at first, he didn't enter the war as a pilot. He entered as a cavalry officer. He was moved to the Air Force in 1915, where he quickly showed his prowess with flying. Just 2 years later, he had 16 confirmed kills, already earning him the medal of Germany's most credited pilot. In April of 1917, he himself downed 22 planes, and this was the first time he was flying his infamous plane, a bright red Albatros D. This, combined with the fact that Freiherr was the German word for Baron, gave him one of history's most iconic nicknames, the Red Baron. However, his luck ran out mere months later. In July of 1917, he crashed his plane in Belgium after being attacked by a member of Britain's Royal Flying Corps. He sustained a severe head injury, causing his flight to begin to be impaired. His final fate occurred on July 21st, 1918. He was flying near the Somme River at a very low altitude. His cousin was nearby, and was soon fired at by a Canadian pilot named Wilfred Reed May. Once he saw his cousin being attacked, the Red Baron rushed to his aid before additional forces backed up May, causing the Baron to retreat. The fight continued, and the Australian Imperial Force, who was stationed at the village of Vos-sur-Somme, fired at the Baron, and one of these soldiers got lucky. A single .303 bullet hit the Baron through his chest, severely damaging his heart and lungs. His plane went to a steep dive, crashing into the ground. The AIF arrived at the crash site, where they found the Red Baron. Or I guess, they found the dead Baron. That was so stupid, I'm sorry. Now, of course, when you bag the biggest deer, you want the bragging rights, and the Red Baron was the biggest deer of World War I. So people began to argue about who actually landed the fatal shot. The most believable and widely accepted story was that of Sergeant Cedric Popkin. He was an anti-air machine gunner who fired at the Baron twice, and Popkin was in a position to where he could be firing and the impact of the Baron would make sense, but no one knew for sure. Several people have laid claim to the title of Baron Killer, but it's nearly impossible to figure out who really did it. The Battle of Mons was the first major action of the British Army in World War I. Britain declared war on Germany on August 4th, 1917, and just 3.5 weeks later, the Battle of Mons began. This took place in the Belgian city of Mons, which is where the name came from, because remember, Britain got involved with the war because Germany invaded Belgium. On the morning of August 23rd, German machine guns opened fire on the British forces. The Germans were outnumbered, but the British began to suffer heavy casualties, and within 7 hours of the fighting beginning, the British were retreating. But on the night of August 23rd, 1917, both sides of the conflict reported something incredibly strange and otherworldly. As the soldiers were hunkered down, trying to avoid the German machine gun fire, they saw Atlantis soldiers standing before them. But these weren't soldiers of the Great War. No. These were soldiers of the Battle of Agincourt, which is a part of the 100 Years' War, and had taken place 500 years before World War I. The soldiers looked ghostly, and they fired bows at the advancing German forces. Other reports say St. Michael himself came down to fight the Germans. Several said that they had seen 3 wonderful, tall, and bright figures that came and went, helping the British forces get to safety. But did any of this really happen? Well, maybe, but what's more likely is the fact that this was war propaganda being reported as real, in an attempt to prove that the Allied powers were on the right side, because they had divine intervention in protecting them. They also probably peddled this story in an attempt to raise morale with the soldiers on the front lines, allowing them to believe they had angelic protection on their side. The trenches of World War I were some of the worst places to be in throughout history. They were muddy, cramped, and unsanitary. Diseases such as cholera and dysentery spread like wildfire, and they became dumping grounds for trash, empty ammunition crates, used bandages, bone fragments, and torn uniforms. Like we said, these trenches were overwhelmingly flooded and muddy, causing many soldiers to develop trench foot, an infection in one's feet caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions. But above all else, the constant death surrounding the trenches attracted rats, and these rats were massive, due to the trenches' environment of rotted food and corpses providing a golden corral buffet for the rodents. One soldier described how he's awoken by two massive rats fighting over a severed hand. Talk about a blast from the past, as on the very same day I'm writing this massive rat was killed in a trench in Ukraine. That's not a rat, that's a skeever. Dogs, man's best friends. Especially the ones who warn you about mustard gas attacks, which is exactly what Sergeant Stubby did for the 102nd Infantry. Sergeant Stubby was a Boston Terrier who was found wandering the grounds of the Yale University campus in New Haven, Connecticut, where members of the 102nd Infantry were training. The dog hung around the soldiers, especially Corporal James Robert Conroy. It was eventually time for the infantry to head to Europe, and Conroy smuggled his dog with the crew. As they got off the ship in France, Conroy's commanding officer found the dog. The dog immediately recognized rank and saluted the officer as he'd been taught to do at Yale University. Stubby first entered combat on February 5th, 1918, where his leg was injured. He returned to the trenches, but his service didn't calm down, as soon after this, he was harmed in a mustard gas attack. He survived and recovered, and in the meantime, a special gas mask was made for him. This taught Stubby what mustard gas was, so anytime he smelled it, he would alert to bark his crew. Since dogs have heightened hearing, he could hear the whine of artillery shells way before the soldiers could, so he was able to alert them to take cover. By the time the war was over, Sergeant Stubby participated in 4 campaigns and 17 battles. Both Robert Conroy and Stubby survived the war and returned home, where the dog was renowned as a celebrity and war hero. He went through several parades and was given several gold medals. He even met 3 presidents in his lifetime: Woodrow Wilson, Warren Harding, and Calvin Coolidge. Sergeant Stubby passed away peacefully in March of 1926. He received an obituary in the New York Times, and it took up half the page, which is a lot bigger than anyone else would have gotten at the time. Today, you can visit a statue of him in the Connecticut Trees of Honor Memorial in Middletown, Connecticut. In the summer of 1917, 9-year-old Frances Griffith moved from South Africa to England with her mother. The two moved in with Polly and Arthur Wright, and their 16-year-old daughter Elsie. Elsie and Frances were cousins, but I'm not sure if Polly and Arthur were related to Frances's mom or the dad, but it's not important. The two girls were friends, and they spent a lot of time together in the woods behind their house, much to the dismay of the adults, as they would come back with wet clothes and wet shoes. But one time, the kids came back and said something that frankly kinda scared the adults. They claimed they had been playing with the fairies. The adults were skeptical at first, but Frances borrowed a camera from them and went to take picture proof. And sure enough, 30 minutes later, the adults were looking at this. The photos became public in 1919, and an expert in photography, Harold Sterling, said he believed them to be real. The pictures then caught the eye of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes. He and his colleagues investigated the pictures, and they too believed they were real. And this was the story for about 60 years. Yeah, for 60 years, we just casually believed in fairies. Then in 1983, the cousins came forward and admitted they were cardboard figures that they made and took pictures of. They also swore up and down they had seen fairies before, but this was not one of the times. They also said they felt insane amounts of guilt when Arthur Conan Doyle believed the pictures, as he was someone they looked up to and respected. Mercy dogs were dogs that were trained by the Red Cross to fill a pharmaceutical role for the soldiers of no man's land. They were sent out after large battles, or at night, to find wounded soldiers. They were outfitted with water, liquor, and basic first aid supplies. However, if a soldier was really wounded, they were trained to take a piece of the soldier's outfit back to an actual combat medic, so they would know someone out there needed drastic help. The dogs were also taught that if someone was really injured, beyond the point of being saved, the dogs should stay with them as they passed away to provide comfort. The Germans alone had 30,000 Schanneshunds, German for medical dog. Altogether, 50,000 Mercy dogs served between both sides of the effort. The Florentine diamond is a lost jewel of Indian origin. It was said to be light yellow in color with slight hints of green. That's the only part we've all agreed on because everything about this diamond is disputed and argued about. The first genuinely accepted bit says it was mined in the Godavari Delta region diamond mines of India, a place world famous for producing beautiful diamonds. After this, it was sent to Europe, where its insane lifespan of travel began. We're gonna start in 1467, when Charles the Bold was wearing it when he was killed in battle. Some yokel then found it and sold it. It jumps all over Europe for a while, and it even passed through Pope Julius II at one point. It then ended up in Austria as a part of their crown jewels. The jewel remained here throughout all of World War I, but once the Austrian Empire fell after the war, the stone, by order of Emperor Charles I, was taken by him as he went into exile. He sold it to someone close to the imperial family, and then they took it to South America along with other crown jewels. Here, it disappears from history. One rumor says it was recut and taken to the United States, but no one knows for sure, and I'm not surprised. Actually, I am surprised. It's traveled 3 continents over a span of 500 years and bounced between so many heads of state, and it took that long for it to disappear? Third Battle of Ypres, which is more commonly referred to as Passchendaele, saw a battle that began on July 31st, 1917. Ypres is a town in Belgium, and this battle saw German forces fight British and French forces. Mere hours after the battle began, it began to rain hard, like the hardest the region had ever seen. Like for the entire month of August, it rained every day except for 3. This turned the battlefield into a muddy mess. Crater holes created by artillery fire were being filled with water, which turned the landscape to mud. This complicated things in extremely disturbing ways. It was taking a crew of 6 men to wheel a stretcher across the battlefield, and on several occasions, the injured soldiers being carried would accidentally roll off into the ground, where they were sucked and swallowed in by the mud, never to be seen again. The same thing happened with the horses and mules being used to transport materials. In some other stories, trenches would have been bombarded by the constant rainstorms and artillery fire, and eventually, they caved in, trapping many soldiers still inside, giving them a truly grisly fate. Something like this happened more recently, during the first Gulf War. Saddam's Iraqi forces had dug a series of trenches to fortify their front lines, but the United States wasn't interested in fighting trench warfare. They sent in bulldozers to destroy the trenches, burying several soldiers in mud. One soldier said they had no idea how many they killed. They just walked past the bulldozed trenches, seeing arms and legs sticking out of the mud. Back to Ypres. One report said they had no solid ground to stand on during the battle, and they basically had to swim their way through the battlefield. Mud was clear up to their waists. The Third Battle of Ypres ended in November of 1917 and saw 275,000 British casualties and 220,000 German ones. As we mentioned, World War I was the first war with semi-modern technology. Automated machine gun firing made it possible to turn a man into red paste in seconds. And even if a soldier would survive this, they usually had severe damage and disfigurements on their body. Since plastic surgery wasn't widespread yet, veterans who were heavily injured and disfigured from the war turned to Durant Wood, who led the Mask for Facial Disfigurement Department, which was nicknamed the Tin Noses Shop. It was ran out of the 3rd London General Hospital, and here, he would paint these tin masks to cover up any disfigurements the soldiers had, allowing them to hide their scarring in public. The Lost Battalion refers to 9 companies, which consisted of roughly 550 men, that were a part of the United States 77th Division. The 77th Division was ordered to attack German positions in the Argonne Forest, which was a mountain of a task. The Germans controlled the forest for about 4 years at this point, and they were entrenched. Nonetheless, the 77th Division attacked into the forest on October 2nd, 1918, with the belief that the French would be supporting their left flank, and then they had 2 American units on their right. At around the same time the 77th attacked, the French backup forces were attacked by German soldiers, leaving their left flank open. The same occurred with the American units, leaving the 77th Battalion completely alone in the forest. This caused them to quickly become encircled by German forces. What followed was several days of attrition warfare, as the Lost Battalion was quickly running out of food, water, and ammunition. The battalion was about to send out a carrier pigeon, Cher Ami, whose story we will get into in the next entry. The pigeon was able to get help to the battalion. On October 7th, the Lost Battalion was rescued. Out of the 554 men who were surrounded, only 194 remained. Communication was a fickle thing in World War I. Electricity and telephone lines were a relatively new concept, and they weren't widespread across the battlefield. This is where the carrier pigeons come in, one of the most iconic symbols of World War I. Pigeons being used as a mail system dates back clear to ancient Egypt, in which they would tie notes around the bird's legs, and then they would go back to their nest, delivering the message to whoever will be waiting on the other side. Perhaps the most famous carrier pigeon was Cher Ami, French for dear friend. Cher Ami was a homing pigeon donated to Britain to be used for the war effort. On October 3rd, 1918, the Lost Battalion was currently being encircled by German soldiers in the Argonne Forest. To make matters worse, their own unit was firing on their location, not knowing they were there. They were getting desperate, and to make matters even worse, any messages being sent out were being stopped by the Germans. Several human messengers were caught, and their carrier pigeons were also having bad luck. The pigeon carrying the first message, "Many wounded, we cannot evacuate," was shot down. A second bird was sent with the message, "Men are suffering, can support be sent?" That pigeon was also shot down. Finally, Cher Ami was sent out, letting them know where they were and that their own artillery was firing at them. As Cher Ami left, he was shot by the German soldiers. But like the total badass he was, Cher Ami rose and made it home, delivering the message of where the soldiers were located. Cher Ami became the hero of the 77th Division, and remarkably, Army medics were able to save his life. Cher Ami was sent to America, where he was awarded the Croix de Guerre medal for his heroic service. Unfortunately, Cher Ami passed about a year after this, following complications from his gunshot wound. If you remember back in Tier 1, we discussed how the Russian Revolution, led by Vladimir Lenin, directly took Russia out of the war, which of course directly benefited Germany. So there should be no surprise when you hear that Germany was a big help to Lenin. Our story begins in 1887, when Lenin's brother was executed after he made a plot to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. Lenin from here studied law. Thanks to this, he was arrested for a year and was then exiled to Siberia for 3 more. After this, he moved to Western Europe, where he continued his revolutionary activity, and this is where he took the name Lenin. Yeah, his birth name was Vladimir Ulyanov, not Vladimir Lenin. During the 1905 Russian Revolution, Lenin once again returned to Russia, and after it was done, he was once again exiled. Then once the February Revolution began, German authorities helped transport Lenin and his comrades from Switzerland to Sweden, where he then made his way to Russia. Germany had hoped that Lenin would help undermine the Russian government, but they probably never expected him to succeed as well as he did. Lenin made it to Russia, but he wouldn't be staying for long, as he called for the provisional government to be overthrown, which caused him to be exiled once again, this time to Finland. But then he came back to Russia during the October Revolution, where he really succeeded. Throughout all of this, Germany took notes of his actions, making notes of when he arrived and when he would depart Russia. And they even funded the Bolsheviks with millions of Deutschmarks to help them overthrow the government. After Lenin was in control, he made peace with the German government, taking Russia out of the war. In the Scottish town of Dundee, researchers found an old suitcase at the local university. Inside, it was full of photographs, letters, autographs, newspaper articles, syringes, and other medical equipment, all belonging to someone named Margaret Mall. There were also several letters written in English, French, and German, all thanking Margaret for saving their lives. By looking through her belongings, they were able to point out certain dates and facts in an attempt to figure out her identity. They found she was born in Scotland in 1887 and joined the Queen Alexandra Imperial Nursing Service once World War I began. She retired from nursing in 1969, and this is the last piece of evidence in pointing out who Margaret Mole really was. Not much else is known about her, and it's unknown how this briefcase ended up in this university. On April 24th, 1915, 3 witnesses stumbled upon a truly grisly sight. They found a Canadian soldier near the battlefield of Ypres, crucified to a tree, with his body being pinned by bayonets. His body was also riddled by bullet holes. This story immediately spread like wildfire. Just 2 weeks later, The Times, a British newspaper, posted the story. 2 days after this, the United States Secretary of War, Harold Tennant, began an investigation into the matter. After it was brought to his attention by British politician Robert Houston, the two continued their investigation, and this is where the story kind of falls apart. First of all, the French authorities were hesitant in sending any information over. One Canadian colonel was looking into this himself, and he investigated the story, and some details were a little off, like the fact that the crucified soldier was pinned to a barn door and not a tree. Some claimed it was a British soldier and not Canadian. Some claimed it was 6 bayonets that pinned him to the tree. Some said 8. This is why people believe this story was a fake, peddled across the world to further demify the German army. But I mean, are the changes in the story that drastic? It doesn't sound so to me. The only evidence of a German soldier crucifying other soldiers comes from eyewitness accounts that have changed over time. Once again, it's up to you to form your own opinion on whether or not it was real. The 10th Battalion of the 1st Australian Division were nicknamed the Terrible 10, as they were full of fighting spirit that they displayed several times. They're in the middle participating in the Battle of Pochapelle when they're about to raid Celtic Wood, a set of forests that had German dugouts and trenches. The plan was to charge the woods, destroy the dugouts, and get out. A very quick guerrilla-style attack. The 10th Battalion attacked, but their plan wasn't as simple as originally thought. They succeeded eventually, as the Germans retreated a week later, but the events before this are a little confusing. The 37 men of the 10th Battalion disappeared. German records report no attack from them, causing several theories to be raised, but really, there's no mystery here. The soldiers were heavily outnumbered, so it's possible they just were killed and buried in a mass grave. Even more boring is the theory that they were a rounding error. I mean, they were 37 soldiers. It's sad to say, but that's a drop in the bucket for the amount of soldiers that were missing during World War I. Walt Disney needs no introduction. He's one of the most iconic names in not just animation, history as a whole. Disney, like many Americans, answered the call of war once America entered the European conflict. But Walt was still in high school, but this didn't stop him, as he dropped out and tried to enlist. He first tried to join as a part of the Navy, but he was denied for his age. Walt then found himself a part of the Red Cross Ambulance Corps, where he spent the end of the war and months after working as an ambulance driver. He found himself quite homesick in this time, and he wrote a letter to his high school, which is seen here. These are some of his earliest drawings. I'm not sure if this is what the entry is referring to, but this is all I could find on anything Walt Disney newspaper World War I related. Animals played a massive part in World War I. We've already discussed Sergeant Stubby, a dog, and Cher Ami, a pigeon, but now we're going to cover the South African baboon named Corporal Jackie. Jackie's owner, Albert Marr, found the baboon in the early 1910s, living around his farm. He captured him and domesticated him, making him a member of his family. Once World War I broke out, Albert was drafted into the war, but he refused to leave his friend at home. So, Albert's commanding officer allowed it, and Jackie became a part of the soldier's everyday life. He was made a mascot of the 3rd South African Infantry Regiment, and even had an officer's outfit sewed for him. He was even taught how to salute. Jackie also knew how to light a lighter, and would light his fellow soldiers' cigarettes. At night, the baboon would be the first to know when enemies were around, and he would wail, waking up his squadron. Albert was eventually stationed in Europe and was shot in the shoulder here. Jackie never left his side, and he licked the wound while the two waited for help. These two had main character energy, as they survived the Battle of the Somme, in which the casualty rate was over 80%. In fact, the two survived the entire war, and returned home to South Africa in 1920. Unfortunately, Jackie passed away a year later, and Marr lived for another 51 years before passing away in 1973. Philippe Pétain was one of France's most renowned and loved war heroes of World War I. He's best well known for leading the French army to victory at the Battle of Verdun, which earned him the nickname the Lion of Verdun. Once the war was over, he was the head of the French army, and served as a government minister twice. You get the point, everyone in France loved this guy. But this wouldn't last for long. At the onset of World War II, as France was about to fall, Prime Minister Paul Renard resigned, recommending that Philippe Pétain be promoted, and he was. This meant he got to deal with Mustache Man, and deal with him he did. He signed an armistice with Germany, giving them control of the country. The governmental duties were moved to Vichy, which is what earned the country the name of Vichy France during the war. Of course, Germany eventually lost World War II, and France was freed. But there is still the matter of Pétain, as he was tried for treason and was sentenced to death. But he was 89 years old at this time, so he was just placed in prison for the rest of his life. He remained here for 6 years before passing away in 1951. What a way to ruin your legacy, from a universally loved war hero to a collaborator with fascists. On August 6, 1915, German and Russian forces were in a battle at the Ossowiec fortress in northern Poland. The Russians had built this fortress 10 years before this, and it was 30 miles away from their border, and it set upon the only crossing of the Bivra River, making it an incredibly valuable target for the Germans. The Germans tried twice before to take the fort, and the third attempt was their most brutal. They began their attack by raining down artillery fire on the fortress, and they followed it up with 30 balloons packed full of poisonous bromine and chlorine gases, blanketing the fort with a foul-smelling green smog. The Germans now expected to quickly take over the fort, but as they got closer, they saw something terrifying burst from the smog. The Russian soldiers were coughing up bits of their lungs and blood as it poured from their eyes and nose. Their skin was bubbling and blistering, and it was literally melting off of them. Seeing these terrifying-looking soldiers caused the Germans to quickly retreat after this. They ran so quickly, in fact, they ran through their barbed wire traps, and they trampled other soldiers as they made a run from the attack of the dead men. Time for a chemistry lesson. Chlorine is a yellowish-greenish gas that breaks down into hydrochlorous and hydrochloric acid once it dissolves in water, which makes up about 70% of the human body. Bromine, on the other hand, is a reddish fog that melts the skin off anyone who comes in contact. So these Russian soldiers had both their insides and outsides melting, but they still attacked the German forces. 2 days later, the Germans attacked again, and assuming any soldiers left were dead, or they had left, and they had, destroying the fort as they had left. John Parr was the first death of the British Army in World War I, and he died under some mysterious circumstances. John Parr was a part of the first soldiers that crossed the English Channel into France. He was sent on a reconnaissance mission, and he and his unit established themselves in the Belgian town of Belgique, about 8 miles from Mons, because keep in mind, Germany was actively invading the nation of Belgium at the time. Soon after this, John was sent further into Belgium, and this was the last time he was seen alive. It's suspected he encountered a German patrol and was killed. As the British army retreated from the area shortly afterwards, John Parr's body was left behind. The Germans buried him, and a headstone was added once the war was over. After John was reported as dead, his mother wrote to his regiment's headquarters asking about her son, but it was unable to be stated with any certainty what actually happened to him, because the story I just told you may have been a cover-up. The killing of John Parr was witnessed by an 8-year-old Belgian girl who claimed a German soldier ran through her garden to shoot him. After the war was over, a historian named John Cooksey studied the incident and claimed that there was no way the Germans were in the area at the time. No journals mentioned contact with British soldiers, and they just weren't that far into Belgium yet, so Cooksey has proposed the idea that a spooked Belgium may have killed him. He proposed that the Belgians had not seen British soldiers yet, and wouldn't know they would be there. So maybe someone got scared of this random soldier hanging out in the front yard and killed him. But with the reluctance of his unit refusing to reveal what happened, some have proposed that he could have been taken out in a friendly fire incident, as several British soldiers were in that area at the same time looking for Germans. Maybe a trigger-happy and scared Brit killed John Parr. No one knows for sure. Once World War I was over, the veterans weren't treated with the respect they deserved. These brave men and women had just faced down hell on earth, and a lot of times when they came home, their government spit in their face. We know about the Americans' bonus army, which was made up of World War I veterans who were wanting their well-earned paychecks, and a story quite similar to this happened with Canadian soldiers. Kimmel Park is a military training base located in North Wales, and the Canadian sector was called Kimmel Park. After the war was over, about 15,000 Canadian soldiers were stationed here. They were wanting to go home, but they were forced to stay and live in these horrible working conditions. One soldier wrote about his experience, saying these men were on half rations, there was no coal for the stove in the cold gray huts, and they hadn't been paid for over a month. 42 had slept in a hut meant for 30, so they each took turns sleeping on the floor, with one blanket each. While these soldiers were kept in these awful conditions, their officers were allowed to come and go from Kimmel Park as they pleased, and they were being paid. Seeing the difference in treatment caused the situation to reach a boiling point on March 4th, 1919, in which the Canadian soldiers rioted across Kimmel Park. There's not much information on what exactly happened, but once it was over, 5 men were dead. The soldiers got what they wanted though, as most of them returned home by the end of March. The Zabrina is a 3-mast schooner that was originally built to transport supplies between Argentina and Uruguay. It was later sent to the Mediterranean to make the trade routes there, and was operating out of the United Kingdom. On September 15, 1917, the Zabrina was loaded full of coal at Falmouth in the UK, to be sent to Saint-Brieuc in France. Only 2 days later, the Zabrina was found washed ashore near Cherbourg. The ship was completely intact, but its crew was nowhere to be seen. An investigation was launched, and the immediate thought was that the Germans had targeted it. The Zabrina was transporting coal to France, making it a viable military target. But if the Germans attacked the boat, why would they take the crew and leave the ship? And once the war was over, the Germans said they never attacked the Zabrina. They were just as confused as the British and French. But I mean, people can lie, and it's possible the U-boat that would have attacked the Zabrina was lost before they could report it. So what happened to this crew? Why would they abandon their ship? Okay, in beginning research and writing for this entry, I had no idea what scuttling meant, so I looked it up. Scuttling means to move quickly with small, short steps, especially in order to escape. But when referring to ships, it means to sink it with intention, which is what happened to a sizable part of the German fleet. Once the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, part of the negotiations including the demilitarization of the German army. The U-boats were seized immediately, and the surface ships were stored in Allied and neutral ports until a further decision could be made. On November 15th, British Admiral David Beatty presented the terms of surrender to German Admiral Hugo Muir. Muir refused to be the one to hand the ships over, so he delegated the task to Rear Admiral Ludwig von Reuter. On November 19th, the fleet of 74 German warships left the rendezvous of David Beatty's ships in the North Sea. Once they met, this convoy consisted of 191 Allied ships and 70 German ones, making it the largest fleet of warships ever assembled. The German ships were disarmed and were placed in control of the Allies, much to the dismay of von Reuter. The ships were in limbo for a while. Many Allied powers wanted their share to boost their own fleets, while Britain just wanted to scrap them. The ships were interned at the massive natural harbor of Scarpa Flow in the Orkney Islands. Once at Scarpa Flow, the 20,000 German crew members were gradually sent back home, but some remained aboard to take care of the ships. We're now in May of 1919, and it's ordered that these interned ships are to be completely handed over to the Allied powers, which von Reuter didn't like. He was ordered to scuttle his ships if they were going to fall into the hands of the Allied powers, so he began to formulate a plan. He saw a chance to act on the morning of June 21st, once the British fleet left Scarpa Flow for exercises. He gave the order, and the portholes, torpedo holes, anything that could be opened to allow in water were opened. Out of the 74 German ships interned here, 52 of them were scuttled within 5 hours. This would be the day of the final German casualties of World War I, as several German sailors were shot by the British after scuffles arose from the Germans refusing to stop and refusing to help save the ships. Von Reuter was arrested, along with 1,800 of his men, but they were released in 1920. France and other allies were furious about the scuttling, as they wanted some of these ships. Salvage operations began in 1919, and out of the 52 that were scuttled, 45 were scrapped, and 7 are still at the bottom to this day. The North Channel connects the Irish Sea to the Atlantic Ocean and has proved vital to anyone who was looking to sink British ships, including the SMUB-35, a German submarine. In the early hours of April 30th, 1918, the U-boat was sitting and waiting in the channel, hoping to stop any merchant ships heading from Brazil and the United States to the United Kingdom. U-boats had already sank nearly 300,000 tons of Allied shipping, but not a single pound was taken down by Gunter Creech, the commander of UB-35. He was getting frustrated, and as he looked through the binoculars of the ship's conning tower, the ship was suddenly rocked by a massive surge on its starboard side, followed by a massive thud as something landed on the top of his ship. Creech looked out, and what he saw was downright terrifying. He saw a monster, a beast with large eyes and a horn sort of skull. The creature's body was serpentine, and it latched onto the submarine and refused to let go. The monster's weight and power was so strong that it was forcing the 730-ton submarine into the water, and the hatch was open, because before this, the crew was standing on their boat like this for some reason. Why did they do this? That's not the point of a submarine. Anyways, Creech ordered his crew to fire into the monster with their weapons, and eventually, it let go of the submarine and sank back down into the channel, never to be seen again. The U-boat's forward deck was severely damaged, and it was unable to dive, leaving the boat as a sitting duck for any British ships to see. As dawn rose, the HMS Corpus found UB-35, and the crew immediately surrendered and basically ran into the arms of the British crew. They revealed their tale, and the Corpus sank the U-boat soon after this, burying any evidence of this sea monster. There's really no smooth way to transition to this next part, so I'm just going to drop it hard. People believe the U-boat was attacked by the Loch Ness Monster. The Loch Ness Monster is a supposed water cryptid that was said to live in Loch Ness, Scotland. The description of the U-boat attacker and the Loch Ness Monster are quite similar, and their locations are pretty close. I don't even want to look at this with skepticism. We know nothing about our oceans. I'm more inclined to believe these spooky stories of sea monsters because of that. Plus, I just think it's cool. I usually end these more conspiracy-related entries with use your own discretion, but not this time. This happened for sure. Bertha Trost was a British socialite of German descent who moved into the nation around 1895. She quickly established herself within the community by opening 2 stores and would later go on to host grand parties, quickly making her a beloved figure in Britain. In 1915, she heard about her German son being captured and held in Britain, so she used her connections to find out any information she could about him. Scotland Yard quickly took note of this, and once they found out she had German roots, she was exiled from the country, as it was thought she was spying for her home country. Kinda similar to Mata Hari from a few tiers back. Harry Houdini is another famous name in history. He's best well known for his escape artistry and for looking like Jeremy Allen White. Like, come on, make the biopic already. Anyways, Harry Houdini was able to use his skills at escapery. Is that a word? I don't think it is. But he taught his skills to American soldiers about to enter the war in Europe. He hosted his lessons to soldiers across the country. He was able to teach them how to dislocate their thumbs to escape handcuffs, and how to escape any rope restraints that may be placed upon them. Most importantly, he taught them how to escape from a sinking ship. Houdini realized how much of a time sink this would be, and he had a tour that was upcoming. But Houdini promptly canceled the tour to focus on teaching these soldiers these important and maybe life-saving lessons. Tier 7 begins with a mysterious sketchbook whose author has been lost to history. The sketchbook has 130 watercolor and pen sketches that are simply initialized JM. On one of the paintings, He writes a dedication to his daughter Adele. Most of the artwork are in or around France and Belgium, and we know he survived the war, as one of the artworks is dated 1920. JM's identity has been lost to history, but we can study his paintings to see his journey. They depict horrifying imagery of trench warfare and war-ravaged landscapes. Perhaps his darkest image is the aftermath of a gas attack that had killed a horse. Why did he feel the need to paint that? Anyways, JM may be lost, but his artwork has been stored at the University of Victoria Special Collections Library. Throughout both World Wars, theories of a corpse factory that was turning human corpses into soap have popped up. I discussed them with the Eustachian in my World War II Iceberg, but stories of this first popped up in World War I. Jesus Christ, where do I begin? If you watch my World War II Iceberg, you know my pronunciations are rough. Cadaver Vertungsschalt, Cadaver Vertungsschalt, Cadaver Vertungsschalt. Fuck. Cadaver Vertungsschalt, literally German for carcass utilization factory, which is how I will be referring to it from now on, was a rumor that German soldiers were using the bodies of their own soldiers to render the fat off to be used to make soap. It first popped up in June 16th, 1915, in which English writer Cynthia Ashquith noted in her diary about hearing the rumor to the factory. In 1917, the story was posted in some of Britain's most influential newspapers. The first English account of a real and locatable physical location of a factory was revealed in 1917. British reporter Carl Rosner described a bad smell coming from a cadaver rendering factory. The word cadaver is originally German, but it's used to refer to dead animals there, not humans. English users, we use it to refer to dead humans though. This is where the rumor popped up, and this rumor spread far and wide. So far and wide, in fact, it hit China, and the authorities there were disgusted. So disgusted, in fact, they joined the war against Germany, which is exactly what the British and other allies wanted. Mafia, or Mafia, I don't know, it's just the word Mafia with an extra F, was a secret organization that was founded in 1914 by Czech politician Edvard Benz. Mafia was based in structure like the infamous Sicilian mafias, and was a central part of early Czechoslovakian resistance. Their main goal was to overthrow the Emperor of Austria, to cause the country to fall apart so that an independent Czechoslovakia could rise. Their plots in society as a whole was exposed in 1915 by Austria-Hungary, and several members were arrested. Edvard escaped from Austria-Hungary, and he, like 20 years later, became the president of Czechoslovakia. So I guess he got what he wanted, just by different means. During the Battle of Gallipoli, E Company, which was made up of about 100 lifelong friends and war colleagues, disappeared without a trace. The unit was originally founded in 1908 by King Edward VII. He asked Frank Beck, who was the land agent responsible for the Sandringham estate, to found this company. He gathered 100 of his close friends and employees of the estate to form this battalion. The Sandringhams were a part of the troops that left Liverpool on July 30th, 1915, headed for the Gallipoli Peninsula, led by Captain Frank Beck, their founder. The soldiers landed, and like we discussed earlier, Gallipoli was brutal, and it was hitting the inexperienced Sandringhams hard. Just 2 days after they landed, they were ordered to advance further into Turkey. Even though the Turkish soldiers were still miles away, the British forces were being cut down by heavy artillery fire and sniper nests. In the midst of the bloodshed, Colonel Beauchamp announced, "Now boys, we've got this village, let's hold it." And this was the last time he and his soldiers, including the Sandringhams, were spotted. Once the smoke cleared and the war was over, the Gallipoli battlefield was searched, and 13,000 bodies were found. And a lot of these were near a small farm, which people assumed was the one Colonel Beauchamp declared as captured. The area was searched, but not much was found. 4 years later, a body of a British officer was discovered. It was the body of Frank Beck, the founder of the Sandringhams. Many years later, in April of 1965, during the 50th anniversary of the Gallipoli landings, a former New Zealand engineer, Friedrich Reichhardt, suddenly dropped a bombshell of a story. He claimed that he had watched 6 to 8 long loaf-shaped clouds lower to the ground, pick up the soldiers, and leave. But his testimony mentioned the wrong dates, wrong location, and wrong battalion names. What a detour. There's no mystery here, guys. Turkish soldiers hardly took prisoners of war. The Sandringhams were picked off and killed, and their bodies are scattered throughout Gallipoli. The original frag grenade was created to resemble the size of a baseball because the American soldiers were so used to the weight and throwing technique of one, so the manufacturers wanted to replicate it with the frag grenade. Australia had something very similar, but they weren't used to throwing baseballs, they were used to throwing boomerangs. This is the boomerang grenade, a proposal behind a grenade design for the Australian Army of World War I. While this sounds good on paper, stop and think about a boomerang for a second. Imagine yourself picking one up and throwing it. What do? Yeah, you don't want a grenade doing that. This was a short-lived idea and was not mass-produced in any fashion at all. By 1917, the British Middle Eastern campaign was basically over, and the Ottomans were almost beaten. But the Ottomans had captured the city of Sharia. Before this, British planes had dropped cigarettes and leaflets over the Ottomans in an attempt to coax them into a surrender. The Ottomans, however, just happily took the cigarettes and continued to fight. So it was looking like the British were going to have a large and costly battle with the Ottomans. This wasn't until a British pilot got back into his plane and flew over the city, dropping more cigarettes, which the Ottomans happily accepted. But something was different with these ones, as the Ottomans hardly fought back after smoking the cigarettes, and thanks to this, the British were able to capture the town. So what happened? It's not hard to figure out. The cigarettes were laced with vast amounts of opium, causing them to be way too high to fight back, giving the British a simple capture mission. I'm not so sure what this one's referring to. A sentry was someone who was posted to watch over no man's land all night long. This, of course, was a very important job, and soldiers who fell asleep faced severe consequences. They would be crucified. I don't know where the permanent Russian part comes in, but what I can assume is that a Russian soldier was forced to be a sentry permanently and went crazy from a lack of sleep. That's my guess. If you know who the sentry refers to, please let me know. While Europeans were off in some foreign nation fighting the war, Scottish women were fighting their own battle at home. The city of Glasgow saw thousands of jobs get added in World War I, especially at the docks and munitions factories. With new jobs comes people wanting these jobs, and these people needed housing. And landlords saw this as an opportunity to get rich by raising the rent on already existing tenants. These tenants were mostly women, as their husbands had already left for war, but these women weren't going to accept the terms laying down. So November 1915, they began a rent strike. 20,000 women and laborers went on strike, and they succeeded, as the rent was lowered back down to its pre-war levels a few days later. You hear that, city folk? I live in West Virginia, so rent here is like a sack of corn a month. But I know you're getting price gouged out there. Do something about it. Tier 8. We're at the very bottom of the iceberg, and we're beginning with the stab in the back myth. The stab in the back myth is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that was spread throughout Germany in 1918. It claimed that Germany did not lose the war on the battlefield, but instead was betrayed by the Jewish populace of Germany during the nation's revolution in 1918 to 1919. The myth was started and spread by Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg, two German generals who didn't want to admit the German army was defeated. Ludendorff in particular was determined to blame the citizens, claiming they stabbed Germany in the back, giving it its namesake. The myth was also adopted by the National Socialists and, of course, Mustache Man, who used it to exploit and gain the trust of veterans and other Germans who were upset about losing the war, and sadly, it was used for justification during the Holocaust. We've discussed in several entries about how dogs were helpful in World War I. It's now time to discuss how they were our enemies. As we discussed, the Battle of Mons was the first major action done by British Army in the World War I, and it was awful, made even worse by the fact a werewolf was hunting the soldiers, allegedly. Canadian veteran F.J. Newhouse described the story of a gigantic, otherworldly dog that hunted British soldiers in no man's land. According to this veteran, a German doctor named Gottlieb Hochmuller was developing otherworldly weapons to sway the war to his nation's favor. He roamed the country's asylums, where he found a soldier who had gone mad in his hatred for England. With the consent of the German government, He took the brain out of this madman and placed it into the skull of a Siberian wolfhound. Stay with me. The dog was cared for, and it grew into a powerful wolf. Once ready, it was released into the trenches to hunt the British. What the hell? That read like a bad H.P. Lovecraft novel. But is there any truth in this unbelievable legend? Perhaps yes, really. Really Historic Mysteries. Really Historic Mysteries, the only website I can find anything about this on. Alright, I'll hear you out. On the night of November 14th, 1914, Captain Yeskes and 4 of his soldiers went missing. A few days later, they were found with teeth marks on their throats. They were dead. But this doesn't prove anything. It just proves a wolf killed them, not this Frankenstein monster abomination of one. So where did this story come from? Well, Newhouse claimed that certain papers were released by Dr. Hochmuller's house, which proved this legend, but guess what? These papers have been lost to history. Who could have guessed? I much prefer the stories of dogs in war who are friendly and helpful, not abominations that kill British people. Luckily, Prince the Dog is more of the first one, and nothing like the second. In September of 1914, Private James Brown left his wife and dog to go fight in World War I. James left his town of Hammersmith to be stationed in the French town of Armentre. This next part is debated. It's said that James Brown saw a dog that looked just like his, and he called his name to it, and Prince responded, coming to him. Or, it's said that one of James' friends found the dog and brought him to James. Regardless, Prince had followed James to war, and keep in mind, this was essentially London to Paris, a distance of 322 kilometers that crosses the English Channel. The battalion quickly accepted Prince, and he stayed with them during the entire war, before the duo peacefully returned to England in 1919. While the American soldiers were facing the Germans in Europe, American schoolchildren in California were facing an equally threatening and deadly force: squirrels. In 1918, the state's horticulture commissioner, George H. Heck, began recruiting the so-called school soldiers in an attempt to completely wipe out the squirrel population of California. But why? How much hate do you have to have in your heart to start a campaign to kill squirrels? Look at them, they're adorable! So what did they do to invoke the wrath of George Heck? For years, California farmers were desperately trying to fight back the squirrels, as they were seen as pests and a source of disease. They were also eating and destroying an estimated $480 million of our modern time money and crops. California set aside $40,000, about $816,000 today, to fight the squirrels, and the money was spent appropriately, with several anti-squirrel campaign posters, and over 500,000 leaflets that were spread out across the state. To sweeten the deal, the kid who killed the most squirrels was to be given $50, modern day $800. By the time the so-called Squirrel Week was over, students had turned in 104,000 squirrel corpses, and some absolute psycho brought in 3,700 alone. Jesus Christ. The state considered their squirrel bounty system to be a great success. But even today, ground squirrels are considered a pest to Californians, but there aren't any bounty posters floating around yet. Gavin, you watching this? You have a population of 172,000 homeless people who are in desperate need for compensation. Bring the war on squirrels back. And here we are, the absolute bottom of the iceberg, and Jesus Christ, it's a doozy. To call No Man's Land scary is like calling the ocean deep. It's a surface level statement. Most soldiers were simply afraid of the stretch of land because anyone who would step on it would be immediately torn to shreds by machine gun fire on the opposite end of the trench. But some soldiers were afraid of what populated No Man's Land at night: the wild men. The first report of the wild men described bands of deserters from every side of the conflict living deep within the abandoned trenches. At night, they would come out and would scavenge the corpses for any supplies, and if they couldn't find anything on them, well, they still had the body. The earliest report of this happening was in the 1920 memoir, The Squadron, by Arden Arthur Humwell Beeman, a British soldier. He says his encounter happened in 1919 on the marshes of the Somme River. He said he watched 24 German soldiers disappear into the ground. deep within a set of abandoned trenches. They waited for the soldiers to come out, but they never did. At night, they would hear inhuman cries and rifle shots coming from within the trenches. Other reports have popped up detailing the same thing, and this is one I believe. Now, the story could have changed and evolved into demons living underground eating soldiers, but the idea of soldiers deserting their posts and then forming a community underground in the abandoned trenches, it's believable to me. If Spanish flu, trench foot, gunfire, explosives, giant werewolves, chemical warfare, airplanes, drowning in mud, or the 100 other ways soldiers died in World War I, there were also bloodthirsty packs of wolves that stalked the trenches and forests, and they became a common enemy of both sides. Wolves were naturally attracted to all the dead bodies that littered the battlefields, but from here, they began to attack the living soldiers as well. The biggest concentration of this happening was in the forests of Lithuania, Poland, and Belarus, where Russians and Germans were fighting one another. Their forces were also getting picked off by these vicious packs of wolves. So November 1947, 1947? No, that's World War II. What did I write? So in February of 1917, the two formed a temporary ceasefire to hunt the packs of wolves stalking their soldiers. There's no exact number of how many were killed, but the figure is in the hundreds. Whoa, you still with me? Wake up, the video's over. We did it. We covered the mysteries and obscurities of World War I Iceberg. What now? That's up to you. Well, it's actually up to me because I edit the videos, but I would love to hear input on what's next. It probably won't be an iceberg. I've got a few in mind I want to cover, but I don't want to just be an iceberg channel. I've got a few non-iceberg videos coming up for the rest of November and December, so if you're interested, make sure you subscribe to me to be the first one to know. Also, if you want to be really in the know, I usually post updates on videos to my Discord server. It's linked in my bio if you're interested. Alright, I'm done talking. Have a wonderful day, everyone.